Hi, you're 12 Sociology. Welcome to this lecture looking at the feminist view of education. And it's worth making note that feminism is the second critical theory that we've been looking at, the first one being Marxist, in the sense they are critical, if you like, of the way the current system operates and argues that we are in a sort of state of conflict, if you like. But this, for them, the conflict is along gender lines and not class lines, like Marxism. So, according to feminists, one of the main roles of education system is to maintain gender inequality and to reinforce patriarchy in some of the following ways. For this section, I would like you to use your textbook, page 73 to 75. Just at the very bottom of page 73 it starts. And can you please read and make notes on these different areas and add them to your PowerPoint. So some of the topics I want you to look at, the sections I want you to look at in the book, looking at how gendered roles are reinforced in school, and make note particularly what Skelton said about opposites and how boys and girls reinforce their gender identity through behaving in very opposite ways, and if you can think of an example of that. Can you think of any ways in which gendered language used in school or around school might reinforce gender inequality, or the idea that, you know, men are superior to women, or the objectification of girls or women? But also think about language around sort of titles given to teachers as well, and how that might reinforce patriarchy. There's also a section on gendered physical behaviour, how different groups physically locate themselves around the school. But there's also some other elements to physical behaviour, the sorts of behaviour that you'd associate with boys, and the sorts of physical behaviour you'd associate with girls. And if you can annotate some examples on here, that'd be great. I'd also like to think about what gender stereotypes are reinforced in school. And in the actual textbook, it talks about gendered pursuits, and that's something by Becky Francis. But what sorts of gendered stereotypes are reinforced in school through, for example, school uniform? What stereotypes does it reinforce by boys and girls? The fact that girls wear a skirt and boys wear trousers. And perhaps you could consider what stereotypes exist in other subjects, such as PE, for example. Some feminists would argue we have what's called a sexist curriculum, or a gendered curriculum, in that it is biased in the favour of men or biased in favour of boys. So can you think of any particular subjects that maybe are gender biased and sort of favour men over women? Think about maybe some of the textbooks. Do they seem to portray more men than women doing certain things? So see if you can think of what examples of subjects that could arguably be a bit sexist. Gendered subjects is another area that seems to reinforce gender inequality, not necessarily at school, but certainly later on in life. I'm going to talk to you about that in a section. But if you have a quick look at page 73 in your textbook, that will tell you a bit more about that. There is an argument that there's a very high level of sexual harassment that goes on in schools of female students by male students. To the extent that actually much of it is actually seen as normal. We're going to look at an article in class about this, but things like sexting or sexually explicit messaging, whether it be picture or text, as a form of sexual harassment. Is there particular language that girls just get used to that can be classed as sexual harassment? Is there any sexual harassment that takes place in the hallway that could be classed as groping or something like that? Possibly not at your school, but maybe think about in some of the contexts around the country. Page 73 to 5 also mentions something about the role of teachers. So what role of teachers do they have in sort of reinforcing or maintaining gender inequality between boys and girls and reinforcing patriarchy, the male dominance of women? And there's a section on page 75 looking at the gendered classroom. Now, this is a really interesting notion. It's the idea that girls generally help boys out in the classroom, mixed in co-ed classrooms anyway. Girls quite often will help boys with their work, or they'll help tidy up after them. And there's research being done that girls that kind of engage in sort of what they call sort of outspoken views in the class, if you like, taking on maybe more male roles in the class, because boys generally are a bit more outspoken, but girls that do the same sort of thing are opening themselves out to quite a lot of ridicule and sort of being the mick taken out of them by some of the boys in the classroom. And what sort of impact do you think that sort of has on patriarchy? You know, if a girl is prepared to step up and take a risk and answer a question, gets ridiculed for it, What idea about men and women or typical masculine and female behaviour in school does that reinforce? So I said I'd mention to you a bit more about gendered subjects. So in December 2013, there was a study by the Institute of Physics, and it found that 6 A-level subjects, there were 3 with a female bias, student base, English, biology and psychology, and 3 subjects are studied much more by boys than girls, such as physics, maths and economics. So there seems to be a clear gender divide between these 2 different types of subjects. However, what impact do you think this has in the long term in what goes on in the workplace if girls are typically doing English, biology and psychology, whereas boys are doing physics, maths and economics? What's the long-term impact of this, and how does it help to reinforce that gender inequality in our society? However, there is evidence that boys are being discriminated against, and Mulrine in 2001 said, "Boys have never been in more trouble. They earn 70% of the D's and F's that teachers dole out. They make up 2/3 of the students labelled as learning disabled. They are the culprits in a whopping 9 out of 10 alcohol and drug violations, and the suspected perpetrators in 4 out of 5 crimes that end up in juvenile court. And they account for 80% of high school dropouts and attention deficit disorder diagnoses." It is worth mentioning that this study is done in America. However, the same patterns of behaviour do occur in the UK. So what do you think? Are boys being discriminated against? Is all this stuff happening because the system's unfair? Is it structurally discriminating against boys, or teachers unfairly negatively labelling them and stereotyping them? Or why do you think boys might be acting up like this in school? So this is something to think about. Yeah, feminists say that, schools reinforce gender inequality, but why do you think boys might be, if you like, reasserting quite naughty and deviant behaviour more recently in the education system? And it's something to do with Mitose and Brown's research. If you read about Mitose in the textbook, some changes in the economy, like the lack of opportunities for boys in the workplace and lower skilled jobs, but also changes in what actually happens around school. And there's some argument that's become feminised. So can you think of any evidence of a feminisation of education that might lead to boys reacting in such a hyper-masculine way? So when we look at feminist research, Sue Sharp's possibly the best study to remember at this point. She's a liberal feminist in the sense that she believes that progress can take place through the process of socialisation, and has faith in the current political system to deliver change. She conducted 2 studies, one in 1976 and one in 1991, and she said this illustrated the changes in girls' ambitions. So you don't need to do this because it's on the activity below. In 1976, when girls were asked to put the following things in order: marriage, husbands, careers, love, children, jobs, in terms of order of importance, they ranked them love, marriage, husbands, children's, jobs, and then careers. Later on, she asked another group of girls from the same borough, I think it was Enfield or Ealing, and asked a group of girls from the same age range as she originally asked in 1991, and they put it in order of careers, sorry, that's spelled wrong, careers, jobs, love, marriage, children, and then husband. So as you can see, women now, or girls now, seem to be much more keen to be independent through their education and a career. And what impact has this had? Well, educational achievement for one, like since probably late 1980s onwards, girls' achievement has pretty much skyrocketed, and now they outstrip boys in education. However, will this make them more equal in society? So yes, girls might be overachieving in education, but what's going on in wider society that might actually get in the way of their becoming more equal? Dale Spender and Becky Francis also look at what goes on in the classroom in a bit more detail. Spender found that boys got much more teacher attention than girls, and actually Dale Spender argued that this was unfair because it reinforced the gender inequality. Teachers were much more prepared to help boys out. They were much more prepared to respond to their questioning and spend a lot more time with them on a one-to-one basis, helping them with work. However, Becky Francis did some additional research, and she argued that actually when it comes to boys and teacher attention, most of the attention is negative, and it's more about managing behaviour and probably telling them off rather than supporting their learning. So this could add to the argument, like, is there more gender inequality in schools? Like, do boys get additional attention? Like, what do you think? What's been your experience? Or do you agree with Francis that actually most of the attention that boys get in classrooms is negative? And that might be different depending on what set you happen to be in for a particular subject. But maybe try and think of the subjects where you were in mixed ability, like I said, like history and geography and what have you. Did you really notice a difference in teacher attention, and what impact did that have on you? So, does the glass ceiling still exist out there in the workplace? We're going to be looking at some examples from the Metro, so don't worry about that link just now. And this is kind of a visual representation of the glass ceiling. However, if you look really closely at this picture, is it a glass ceiling just for women? So when we talk about the glass ceiling, it's the idea that women can get to a certain level within a company before they reach an invisible barrier that they can't seem to get through in terms of promotion, normally up to management level or the more senior level. And sort of might want to consider what reasons do you think there might be for the glass ceiling being in place? Like, why do women not get promoted? And again, if you look at this image, is it a glass ceiling just for women? So more recent research has focused on the way boys construct masculinity and girls' femininity within school. Because this has been a real concern of the government, is why are boys underachieving? So Debbie Epstein and Becky Francis, they both suggested that actually boys equate schoolwork with girls and femininity, and then therefore have the view that real boys don't work. And in response to this, they developed what's called a laddish subculture, very similar to Paul Willis's counter-school culture, only they call it a laddish subculture. So, for example, they might see behaviour like always putting your hand up for the teacher's attention as a feminine behaviour, always getting your homework in and getting praised as something that's feminine. So as a result, boys that end up behaving this way can end up getting labelled negatively by their peers. So it's things like, they're such a bunch of girls, or, acting a bit weak or a bit too feminine. And that therefore means that boys are less likely to try hard in class, and that can feed into maybe negative stereotypes about boys, and ultimately it can negatively affect their achievement. But it's worth remembering a bit of AO3 evaluation. Not all girls are doing exceptionally well, and not all boys are failing. Social class is still the biggest indicator of educational success, and Perry and Francis's research in 2010 pointed out that girls on free school meals still underperform middle-class boys, essentially those boys who are not on free school meals. Free school meals is just the general indicator for someone who is possibly working class, because you get allocated free school meals if your parents' financial situation is assessed, if you like. So that's kind of the indicator for those who are probably slightly less well off materially. So essentially, they found that no matter what, middle-class boys therefore do overachieve compared to working-class girls. So you have to be cautious and make sure you don't make statements that are a bit generalised, if you like. You can't say boys underachieve compared to girls, because that's not true. Middle-class boys overachieve compared to working-class girls. You can't say girls do better than English than boys, because, again, working-class girls still tend to do less well than middle-class boys in subjects like English even, which is a subject that girls traditionally do much better in. It's also worth remembering, as an AO3 evaluation of the feminist point of view, that not all schools do reinforce gender inequality. So, sorry this has been cut off at the bottom. Can you think of any ways in which your school currently sort of doesn't reinforce inequality? Like, is there anything about this school that you might say, actually, no, that's not about reinforcing patriarchy, that's actually probably promoting empowerment of girls, or gender equality, if you like. So see if you can annotate some examples on there, and you can use them to evaluate the feminist view of the education system. Because ultimately one of their big criticisms is that they see the world in a very sort of one-dimensional way, that everything's in terms of gender inequality, and they tend to ignore some of the examples of where schools or institutions are actually doing some good work to try and get rid of gender inequality. Thanks for listening.